Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 35 years of law enforcement experience. He spent 12 years with Norfolk Police Department as a police officer. He spent 23 years with the FBI, much of which he spent in the Cellular Analysis Survey team, also known as CAST. He is currently the Director of Training and Professional Services for Hawk Analytics. Please welcome Scott Eicher. Scott, how are we doing?
I'm doing great today, Jason. How are you?
I am doing very well. So there's a lot to get into with you today. Let's start with you as a police officer in Virginia and making the decision to go to the FBI. Did you always want to be part of the FBI, or was this something that kind of developed over time?
It was something that developed over time. I actually went to college for oceanography and then ended up at the end of my career in criminal justice. So those are a big leap. In college, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. Oceanography was my passion when I went in. I went through the courses there, realized I probably didn't want to study plankton. So I moved on to architectural design, and then I took some criminal justice classes, and the criminal justice classes really piqued my interest. While I was still in college, I joined the Norfolk Police Department in Virginia, and I was a police officer for 2 years and then a detective for 10 years, which was fantastic. I was on the street for a while and then got into the detective division where I worked stolen autos first and then homicides and narcotics, and really had a great time at the police department. And I started working some cases with the FBI, some large narcotics cases that kind of piqued my interest. There was an FBI agent in Norfolk that kind of said, hey, you know what? I think you'd be a good FBI agent. Why don't you apply? And 9 months later, I was headed to Quantico, Virginia, then went through the academy there. The FBI decided to send me to Denver, Colorado, which was a great move. Thank God I could have ended up anywhere in the United States. I spent my whole career as an FBI agent in Denver, and it was a good career. About 10 years at the end of my career, I got into the cellular analysis world, then became part of the CAST team.
Because you were one of the original members to this team and it being formed with the FBI, correct?
That's correct. We had some great agents within the FBI, and this is, I guess the CAST team was because it first initiated by a couple guys, one guy in DC, Chad Fitzgerald, and Chad Creasy, and then an agent in Philadelphia named Bill Shute. And they kind of came up with this, our thought that, hey, you know what, we're not really digging into cellular records as we should in our investigations. And they had some cases that they were working that really helped the cellular analysis of who's calling who, dates and times, locations of the phone, were really starting to help their cases. And this was 10, 11 years ago now. And really none of the police departments around the nation were really digging into this. They started to have some classes in Philadelphia, just bringing people in that were working violent crime cases, teaching them the basics of cellular analysis. And I was just lucky. A supervisor came up to me one day and said, hey, we need to send someone to a cellular analysis class in Philadelphia. Do you want to go? I'm like, well, okay, I'll try. And it turned out to be that was the start of my career in cellular analysis field. And that first class in Philadelphia was fantastic. The instructors were great. We had engineers from T-Mobile and Sprint there, and it was fantastic. We learned a lot. And then you kind of come back to your office and then you start working cases, and those cases start to develop your knowledge and perfection in understanding these records, because they're not easy. If it was easy, anybody could do it. And it takes a lot of patience when you're working with phone records, because they're all different, but depending upon if it was Cricket in the old days and how their records were before they were bought out by AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon, all those major companies, and some of the smaller companies like US Cellular all have different records, and they all have different names for the data that they put in those records. And you have to learn that stuff to be able to understand, all right, what does this record tell me? What data is good for me and what data is not relevant to what I'm trying to do?
Because I worked on telephone toll analysis, and I remember getting a subscriber, especially on a prepaid phone. It would be assigned to Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, just having the number and not much else.
Yeah, I totally agree with the invention of prepaid phones where the company really doesn't care on what name or what address is associated with the phone because they already got their money. They've already been prepaid. And so people came up with some funny names. A lot of the times we're able to backtrack those prepaid phones or burner phones, if you want to call them, for the criminals, back to the person. They make mistakes. They call their girlfriend on that prepaid phone. They call their mother on that prepaid or burner phone, and we can backtrack it. And a lot of times, not only who they call, but where they call from. I had a case in Washington, D.C. It was a hired hit on a person, and the suspect used his girlfriend to lure the victim into a meet at a place, at a restaurant. And the girlfriend bought this burner phone, and then she had her own phone, and she basically cold called the victim. Oh, I'm sorry, I got the wrong number. Hey, you've got kind of a sexy voice. So she's trying to get him to talk to her, and he ends up falling for it. And after a week or two of those kind of calls back and forth, hey, let's meet. Victim shows up, and the boyfriend ends up killing him. But in that case, I was able to track the burner phone along with the real phone of the girlfriend that was setting up the victim. So for a week, I was able to track them together, her phone and the burner phone, as she went home, went to work, did other different things. So at trial, I was able to show that burner phone was with that other phone, her real phone, and I'm able to associate that phone with her.
So were you able to identify her personal phone?
Because, let me think back here, because the victim was related to the suspect. I think he had snitched on him in a case prior. They had looked at the suspect and his girlfriend as possible associates.
Okay. So then you can just see that these two phones are traveling together all the time. Yeah.
And they were. And actually the suspect's phone was usually with his girlfriend's phone and the burner phone at the same time. Not always, but they were at times when she was making those important calls, trying to lure him into a location. He was there telling her what to do.
In the beginning, you're part of the team developing CAST. Location and triangulation, trying to pinpoint the exact location, is a little bit different from the way it is now.
Yeah, it had its own quirks and issues back then. When we're dealing with phone records, as I said, each phone company reports their data differently. And the phone companies back then, they didn't want to tell us what all the locational-based information they had. If you remember, toll records were really just who's calling who, but no information on what tower or what sector was used during that call. And when you ask for records nowadays, you have to make sure you're saying call detail records, because those actually include who's calling who, date, time, duration, and the tower and sector that was used either to initiate the call or the handoff calls and the end tower used. So there's different companies that provide more or less information. But back then, we kind of had to pry the door open from the phone companies and say, hey, we know you're recording this tower location information for when these phones are making these contacts, either for calls, text messages, or data sessions. We want that data, and had to force them with search warrants. But they wouldn't tell us the other information that they had. And I'm referring to what we kind of generally refer to as per call measurement data. That is additional data other than just the tower and sector, which is the side of the tower. They also record distance from the tower the phone is and an estimated location of that phone based on that distance, maybe from that tower and other towers. So this per call measurement data was kind of hidden by the phone companies. I remember a case, it happened, I might get the city and the phone company wrong, but it happened to be a victim, a missing girl that was kidnapped and then later killed. And that victim's family member worked for one of the phone companies. Because we were working that case, they bent over backwards to try to help us find where she was. And they gave us per call measurement data from one of the phone companies. We had never seen this before. We mapped this stuff out, and the distance measurements from the two phones or from the two towers that were used crisscrossed at one point, and that's exactly where we found the victim's body later on. So sad story, but it opened the door now. Okay, you've got more information that you're not providing or letting us know. We need to start getting this information. So then we started pushing all the major phone companies to give this per call measurement data to us. Took them a while, but eventually AT&T, Sprint, Verizon, T-Mobile all give us that type of information.
What year was this? Do you remember?
Whew. It was
And
early on in the...
And did they always have this, or was this something that they developed in between when you started and then?
No, they had it. They had that information in their systems. You got to remember, we're dealing with the legal compliance people at the phone companies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're not engineers. So until we push past the legal compliance people and say, hey, you've got this data, go to your engineers and see if you can pull this data and give it to us via legal search warrant or court order. Eventually, they all were able to find that data, preserve it, and then give it to us. Now, each company has different preservation rules on how long they keep that. That per call measurement data often expires within days of the network. I think Verizon's the smallest. It's 7 to 10 days. If you don't get that preserved with the phone company, that per call measurement data, Verizon calls it RTT data, round trip time, basically distance from the tower, it gets just deleted in the network after 7 to 10 days. So you can't get that data all the time.
Yeah. Now, I remember talking at a conference that I went to. This is probably 2005, 2006. And there was representatives there from the phone company. They were inundated with subpoenas. They're running a business of cellular phones and not anticipating that they're going to have to hire a whole staff to basically handle all the subpoenas that they're getting on a daily basis. And so they have to come up with the whole process. And of course, us on the law enforcement side, you know, we want that data yesterday, right? And then we can't be waiting for you to sit there and sift through all these requests when you're undermanned. It was a cultural shift of going from running a cell phone company to then having to create a whole department in the company to just deal with subpoenas.
Oh, and that is so true. And then we had problems with backlogs of getting that data. And as you said, they're in it to make money for the company, and this legal compliance group that they have to form doesn't make any money for them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes charge some money, but really it's a black hole. They got to hire compliance people to answer the phone. They have to get programs in place to pull those records. They have to have lawyers that review the search warrants. It just got crazy for a long time. And it was pulling teeth, you know, for them. They didn't want to put money into it, and they still have problems. T-Mobile is one of the companies, very good company. We work well with them, but they're always behind even now on getting records. Eventually, they'll hire more people or give them overtime to try to catch up to a 2-week turnaround, but then they eventually fall behind, and they're several months behind. So it's not a moneymaker for them.
It's interesting because it got to the point, I don't know the exact cases that there were, but judges got to the point where we're going to fine you X amount of money per day that these aren't responded to, right? Because they were that far behind. And it was just a total cultural shift for them.
Totally. I totally agree with that. And we did have to push, get judges to start threatening them to get them at least catch up. We can't wait 9 months for some records that only take a couple minutes to pull. But when law enforcement started to realize this data was really going to help their cases, they were so inundated, they just couldn't keep up. And I felt sorry for them, but the managers at those companies really needed to just put more money into the program. And we're running into that now with like Google. We do a lot of stuff pulling information, locational phone information from Google location information and geofences, and they're really far behind. And it's probably been, I want to say 3 to 4 years that we started getting that Google data, and they're in the same boat. They're getting inundated by law enforcement giving them records or requests for records, and they're just so far behind that 7 to 8 months I've been hearing now.
So then as you're developing CAST, or as the team's developing, you start to develop standards. And as you're working on different cases, and let's start with that. Let's talk about the different types of cases that you handled while at CAST.
We had really no limit on the types of cases. We obviously didn't want to handle domestic or some of those smaller cases or misdemeanors. So we kind of just set the bar at serious felonies. So we worked homicides and kidnappings, missing persons, and exigent cases. And I still do that now with ad hoc analytics, helping law enforcement with their cases. But we basically were kind of the leaders in the field in this technology and understanding what to get from the phone companies, how to map it, and how to testify to it. So we handled cases all around the nation. I handled cases in DC, Florida, Alaska, a lot here in Colorado, where I was an FBI agent and still am, but I actually handled cases in numerous states around the nation. So we became national assets for the CAST team, and we would handle any cases that requested to help. And most of those, I'd say 80% were local cases. They weren't FBI cases. So it was a local DA needing an expert to map and testify to these call detail records for a homicide case.
And I just thought of a question there, because one of the things that I ran into kind of the hard way, I guess it could have been a lot worse, is I'm working on telephone toll records analysis, and I go to this training. This training talks about the wording to put into a subpoena, and it's talking about specifically what to ask for and things to expand the net of your search. He talks about all the different things you could ask for in a subpoena. Like, for instance, not only that, obviously the subscriber information and the telephone tolls, but if that person has another phone with your company too, we want to identify that. So I come back and I'm like, hey, we can do all this stuff with the subpoena. And they're like, oh, we're in Maryland. We can't do that. There's laws in Maryland. The instructor was from New York. New York had different laws in terms of subpoenaing records versus Maryland, versus across the United States might have different laws for this in each state. So as for you, when you're coming in from the FBI, but you're working local, how did that translate?
Most of the times, the law enforcement agency had already obtained the records, and I was brought in to look at it afterwards. But there were cases where, hey, they're calling us for a missing person or a kidnapping. Because we had been in the field and dealing with these phone companies for a while, we knew the terminology to ask for. You're right. That was one of the biggest issues back then. Was, all right, what can I ask for? What terms do I need to put into my court order or search warrant or subpoena to be able to get these records? What can I get with subpoena? What can't I get with a subpoena versus a court order or a probable cause-based search warrant? So, and that's changed over time. But one of the things that we do here at Hawk Analytics is we have templates for all of our customers and anybody in law enforcement working call detail records. We have a website that's free to anybody that's in law enforcement, and they can go in and look at our templates, use our templates if they want. They have all the terms in there, and we change it. We keep it updating it. If we get a different term from Verizon on their voice over LTE records and how to ask for those, that was a big problem back then in making sure we were asking for the right stuff, because the lawyers at the phone company are like, you didn't put it in the court order, you don't get it, right? Yes. We're not going to offer it to you either. Hey, did you also want this? They're not going to do that. So they just read what's in the court order. So one of the things at Hawk Analytics we do very well is make sure that everybody knows all the terms. So that's a big help for all of our customers and all law enforcement.
So then once you are past the subpoena stage, then you're getting into getting that data in. The FBI developed a special program to bring in all these records from all these different cell phone companies, correct?
That's correct. And we weren't the only ones doing it in the FBI, but we had our own developers. We worked with a company called Gladiator, and we also developed our own separate program called CASTVIZ, which was a free program. It didn't have all the bells and whistles as the Gladiator program did, but it was good we could give it away to law enforcement so they could start mapping these records. And it was a big help because I remember having to map records by hand. So going line by line, trying to find that tower number, then going to a cell tower list and finding that tower and putting in the latitude and longitude, and then hand drawing a tower and a sector in Map Point, which is not even a program anymore. It was a Microsoft program, but it's not even produced anymore. And then we did it in Google Earth. And then we eventually, within the FBI, we developed our own programs that, with the help of some private sector companies, that took in the call detail records, took in GPS stuff, and also drew out those sectors for us and did a lot of analytical work. Same thing as I was mentioning, other companies have been doing this too. One of them being Cellhawk. They were started a little bit later, but that's where I work now at Hawk Analytics, and our program is Cellhawk, and it does that same stuff. So different companies have different programs to use, plus some programs do some more than others, like the FBI's CAST program. We actually developed some drive testing equipment so we could actually go out and drive test the sector of a cell phone tower to see where it had the best signal, and we could present that in court. And those programs, which were very expensive, in the range of $100,000, were great for us in the FBI, but some of the smaller local police departments couldn't pay that amount for that type of software.
I just got to thinking that even those cell phone companies, just from their perspective, they didn't like to even tell us where their towers were.
Yeah,
right?
that was something that we still not really have a problem with it, but they want to close hold that. I guess it's that competitive thing between companies,
Yeah.
They don't want to divulge that information, but they will to law enforcement.
That's true. So then what standards did the CAST team develop while you were there? Because you eventually go to the point where you develop the techniques, you work on several cases, and then you eventually start teaching local law enforcement what you guys have learned.
That's correct. And I still teach law enforcement now, but I'm teaching things that we've learned I learned in the FBI and the CAST team, learned since I've left the FBI. We're constantly teaching law enforcement, the new stuff that's coming out and the best ways. And we've learned that over trial and error, right? When the CAST team started, our kind of major focus was, we're working fugitives. We need to draw something on a map to send the fugitive team out there to look in this area. We were using what they call pie wedges, which was basically, it looks like a piece of pie with a rounded end. And at that point in time, that was perfect for our fugitive units to go out and say, okay, we're guessing on what the coverage area of this sector is. This was not ever going to go to court because we're just trying to find somebody. So those type maps were perfect for our fugitive guys to go out and say, all right, we're going to start looking in this area. Well, when we were still using those pie wedges with the closed end and kind of estimating coverage, but when it started coming to court, we started having some problems with that. So we kind of adapted. It took us a while to adapt, but we started just depicting the direction of the sector and not any coverage area, because when you get into estimating coverages of a tower and sector for court purposes, you're going to get a lot of arguments by the defense, or even the judge will say, that you're drawing what you believe to be the coverage of that sector. Is it right? How do you know? If you don't know, then you can't draw it and put it on a map and show it to the jury, because it could be prejudicial against the defendant. So we kind of moved from, and that was one of the standards that we kind of developed, which eventually got into the SWEDGE document, which was a document that the FBI and 20 other law enforcement agencies and some private sector companies all helped to had input into this document that basically made the standard for how to map out towers and sectors. Basically, if you don't have any drive testing information, all you can do is show where the tower is and what direction that sector is facing, beam width of that sector, but you can't draw coverage unless you can show where you got that data.
Yeah.
So that was one of the, I think, biggest standards that kind of came out of CAST. We also did a lot of trial and error in testifying. Because we were kind of at the beginning of this field, we did a lot of testimony in cases. A couple of those cases, a case out of Washington, D.C., which was a Jones case for me, and another case out of Illinois, which is Evans' case, which was handled by another CAST member. Those were the cases the judges made decisions on. You can't estimate coverage unless you've done drive testing. So a lot of trial and error in those things.
Yeah, I find it interesting that that's prejudice. That evidence is prejudice against the client or the suspect, right?
Yeah.
So, and in the beginning, this is brand new, so it's brand new for everybody. So it's obviously going to be brand new for defense attorneys as well. So they have this huge learning curve as well as they're trying to defend their clients. Was there anything maybe we'd laugh at now? Some of the things that defense attorneys tried to argue in some of the cases that you testified.
Well, there's been a lot of craziness, from defense attorneys. And one of the things that we did on the CAST team, to be certified, you went through about 500 hours of training. And the last part of that training was a moot court where we'd actually bring in prosecutors from all around the nation that we'd worked cases with. And we had one prosecutor be the actual prosecutor in this mock trial, another prosecutor being the defense attorney, and another prosecutor being the judge. The students had to do an analysis, go out and drive test, and then get up and testify about it. And that's really the best way to learn, the type questions that you're going to see from these defense attorneys, and they can be outlandish. I mean, there's questions like, well, a plane flew over. Did that affect the signal of that cell phone tower? Obviously not. But there's a lot of weird questions that defense attorneys bring up, and you have to be prepared for those. Some of them are very good. These defense attorneys are reading up on it. They're learning from each other, just like law enforcement does. And then they come up with good questions, but you have to be able to explain them. So doing cell phone analysis is not just putting, marks on a map or linking who called who. You have to be able to defend it at a trial. And if you can't get into the technology and get into why, for example, that phone chose that tower to make that call and explain how the network works, you could be in trouble. So some of our, the classes that you can get out there, one that we teach, a 40-hour class here at Hawk Analytics, we go through all that. And we try to prepare you as best as you can to be an expert in testifying to these records, but it really just takes time. I'd hate to be that agent, and I was that agent or that detective, that your first case is a homicide case and you're getting up there and testifying to cell phone records, and there's a defense attorney that's done his job and really, dug into the records and will actually plop the raw records in front of you on the stand and say, tell me what that means. Tell me what this means. Where's that on your map? So you have to be prepared. And if you don't feel like you're prepared, find someone that, has done this before. We do have that service here at Hawk Analytics. You can hire us as an expert, and we're willing to come and help. But we also just help you as best we can. If you got questions, just like when I was on the FBI CAST team, same here at Hawk Analytics, you got questions about your analysis or how the phone records work, and you want to prep before trial and you're going to testify, give us a call. We'll be glad to help.
So do you find it easier or harder towards the latter part of your career to testify as opposed to the beginning, maybe 2010 versus 2019?
Oh, it was much easier. I think as the more times you do it, and I had the benefit of being a police officer ahead of time, and, going to court over traffic tickets and narcotics cases and homicide cases where I was the actual detective handling the case. So I had a lot of experience in courtrooms, so that helped me out. But still, the first time I testified to Cellular Records, they had a quote unquote defense cellular expert on the stand, and he made me look like an idiot. That's still because he knew some terminology that I didn't know. He said one thing that, well, can you ask Agent Eicher what base station controller is? I knew, I just went blank on it. I couldn't remember what that term actually is. But things like that, are learning experiences. You learn the types of questions they're going to be asked, you prepare better, and you immerse yourself in this. This can't be a part-time job. This has to be one of the things that is a major part of your job to be an expert at it.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into some of the cases that you worked in over your career. You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Kyle Stoker, and I'm encouraging you to vote in the IACA elections. So it's a little bit of a confusing process, but between August and September, nominees need to get nominated. So there's a nomination process where they have to get 2% of the membership, and then voting actually starts on October 1st. So for the entire month of October, you have the opportunity to vote for your final candidate. So make sure you go to the IACA website and vote, because our membership has a voice in who leads the organization, and you want to make sure that your voice is heard. Thank you very much.
So this is Sam, and I want to let you know that it's okay to talk to strangers. Obviously not if you are 4 or if you're walking alone at night or in the woods. But in general, if you're just out in your day-to-day life or you're traveling or whatever, talk to somebody, talk to strangers. It makes you a more interesting person because it gives you more perspective on life. Everyone is walking around with an interesting story. So many people will defy your expectations when you see someone and you make certain assumptions about them, whether they're conscious or unconscious. I love the moment when you realize you were wrong. It's a great feeling, and I think it makes your life richer in general. You know, if you're too shy, then maybe just read Humans of New York. That might help you to understand other people's experiences. But I'm just here to say, don't not talk to strangers.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking with Scott Eicher, and he was telling us about his work with the CAST team the FBI developed. One thing that I didn't ask you, Scott, before the break was, as an agent, FBI agent, you're getting the cell phone records yourself and you're analyzing the data. But the FBI also has analysts working as well. So kind of differentiate between the role of the agent analyzing cell records and the role of the analyst analyzing cell phone records.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Well, you know, in the FBI, we did have analysts and still do, and, you know, their career path has changed over the years. I think, before 9/11, we had analysts doing different things. And then after 9/11, we kind of made analysts more involved in cases and more big picture stuff. But when you deal down into the nitty gritty of cell phone record analysis, at least with the CAST team, we were teaching analysts a little bit of it. So they want more of a knowledge that it's out there. But we as the agents were actually getting the records because we had to be the ones that knew what to ask for from the phone companies and being the affiant on the search warrant to get the records. And we were also out there chasing the fugitives, looking at these phone records and, live tracking phones. So we didn't have the analysts embedded with us at that point. We had really just the agents who were doing this type of analysis because we're also out in the field, chasing bad guys. It was more safer for us to be out there since normal analysts didn't carry weapons. So that kind of analyst, agent or detective analyst differences, it really was not much other than we were out on the field where most of the analysts were inside the office. So we kind of kept the cellular analysis stuff under the special agent hat because we were out there a lot doing it in the field.
Since you're out on the field, you're targeting suspects to apprehend, or out, as you said, out there trying to make the arrest or identify a person. But in terms of looking at the history of cell phone records and gathering patterns and trying to identify maybe networks, all the people that are involved in a gang or a terrorist organization, that was something different from what you concentrated on. Is that correct?
Yes and no.
Okay.
What I found my career being kind of evolving to is being less of an agent and being more of an analyst. I spent more time doing that type stuff, doing pattern analysis, doing frequency analysis, trying to determine where that person is hiding now versus before when he was not wanted by law enforcement. So it kind of mixed in, but as my career developed, I found myself not going out on the street as much, but spending more time working at my computer and doing that type of detailed work, which basically I was an analyst by the end of my career. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'm not out chasing bad guys anymore. So I'm assisting law enforcement in analyzing those records. One of the most important parts of looking at cell phone records is that detailed work on pattern analysis. Who's calling who, common calls between individuals to lead you to the suspect in a murder or another suspect in a bank robbery, or the girlfriend of the husband that ended up killing his wife. All those things, that link analysis stuff, so important to the analysis of any case, because you want to show link analysis, what's normal in locational information for that phone. Did it change on that day of the crime? Did it change after the day of the crime? Is it normal for a person to be in this area where the crime occurred, or is it just that one time when the crime occurred, that phone was in that area of that crime scene? So it changed over the years for me, and I learned more about being more analytical about pattern analysis rather than just where's that phone right now. It really helped in the fugitive area. We would look at, all right, what towers are using the most? All right, who lives in that area? Is it his parent or his girlfriend? So that would help us look historically, all right, he was in this area a lot, and if he gets back into that area, he's probably at this person's house.
Well, today happens to be 9/11, which 19th anniversary of the attacks. And I know you, in talking in our prep meeting, had a special experience with this and reporting and responding. So if you could, just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. 9/11, obviously a terrible tragedy for us here in the United States, and an attack by a terrorist organization that was large and complex. Really opened our eyes to the things around the world that could harm us here in the United States. I remember driving to work, and I was living here in Denver, so as I was driving to work, the planes were hitting the buildings and crashing on the East Coast, and I was just couldn't believe what I was hearing. Got to the office and started watching the news, and ended up at the command post for about 4 months, working all the suspects in the terrorism in that attack, and all their associates and their associates. You know, you just expand out from the actual terrorists that did the attacks to all their friends, family, associates, trying to determine, are there going to be another attack? Should we be looking more further at these type people? And I was working the terrorism squad back then. We ended up working several terrorism cases, which are a little bit different than criminal cases. We actually go to a FISA court in Washington, D.C. to get a court order for records and a court order to monitor live a cell phone. We have to build probable cause just like anything else. But when we found maybe an associate to one of the 9/11 terrorists, we would identify, their phone numbers, their email accounts, whatever, and then we get court orders to monitor those to see if they're involved in additional terrorism plots or funding terrorism. I remember one of the cases, I worked numerous cases after 9/11, and one of the cases that was, I guess, the bad story, if you want to call it, was related to 9/11, but it was several years later. This was a case that actually occurred here in Aurora, Colorado. It was a suspect by the name of Najibullah Zazi. We had received information from another government agency that he was currently plotting a terrorist attack in the subways of New York, but he lived here in Colorado. This was kind of the case that brought phone analysis up to the top in my mind. I was on the SWAT team at that time, and we had agents from all the surrounding divisions here. We were doing 24-hour surveillance. I was on the SWAT team, and we were posted near his house when we were for weeks while we were building the case, trying to determine, can we arrest this guy? Is he a real terrorist? And one of the things that I was realizing that we weren't doing was looking at his phone records and plotting where he had been. So I went to one of the supervisors and I said, hey, I've been trained in this stuff. Let me get away from the SWAT unit right now and stop sitting in an offsite and let me dig into these phone records. That supervisor at the time just didn't realize the importance of phone records and what it could tell you historically. And he said, no, you got to go do that stuff. So I sat at the SWAT command post in my vehicle at 2:00 in the morning, and I'm analyzing these phone records because I know that it's going to be important. I was able to map the towers and sectors Azazi had used when he purchased the chemicals that he was going to use in his bomb. I was also able to map out the tower that he used when he tested a small portion of the chemicals that he was using to make the bomb. And then I was also able to map his path from Colorado to New York and into the area of New York City where he was visiting all the people, basically his co-conspirators, all the people that he was being trained by to become a terrorist. And I was able to plot all that stuff out. It was later used in his case. He eventually pled guilty and served 10 years in jail for his plotting of the terrorist attack, and it never occurred. He actually cooperated with the government very well and got a 10-year sentence.
So how close was he to putting his plans in action?
Well, to the point that he was testing the chemicals that he was trying to put into the bomb. He was trying to get the right mixture, and he was very close. I think he had not built the bombs yet, but he was testing the chemicals that he was going to put in for the explosives.
Oh, wow. And this is like 2003, 2004?
Actually, this was in 2009.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
so it was a ways afterwards.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he was planning on doing it on 9/11 in 2009.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good for you for having perseverance and not listening to your boss, right?
Sometimes you just have to push your way into it,
I guess one other question I have with my career, I started exactly 2 weeks before 9/11. So in my mind, I only know 2 weeks of law enforcement prior to 9/11. So talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what changed? What were some of the biggest change from before 9/11 to after 9/11?
That is a good question. And looking back on my career, I did spend 12 years as a police officer and then a couple of years as an FBI agent before 9/11. So I had that feeling of we were concentrating on narcotics at that point in time, large narcotics rings. We were concentrating on organized crime. We were concentrating on a lot of different things. But when we got hit by 9/11 and the United States woke up to this event that we realized we were touchable by a small group of guys that could do horrendous damage to and kill thousands of people in one swipe, we got scared. Mm-hmm. And I was in the FBI then. We took a lot of our criminal assets and moved them over to the terrorism side of the house within the FBI. We had been working terrorism. It was like Hezbollah and a lot of different of those terrorist groups over in the Middle East, but we hadn't really realized, Al-Qaeda's reach. That was a mistake we had. We hadn't dug into it enough, hadn't put enough time into it, and we hadn't made those connections overseas that we now do have to be able to kind of better monitor what these terrorist groups are doing. So it was a big shift from criminal to terrorism within the FBI. We still had our criminal units, but they were shrunk down based on some of the things that other agencies could handle.
And so you actually have a couple of different high-profile cases that you've responded to. Columbine, for instance, you were a responder on the school shooting there.
That was an event. I was here in the FBI, pretty new agent. I was in it about 3 years. I remember that call going out. I was on the SWAT team at that time, and call going out from Jefferson County, where Columbine School was, that they needed additional SWAT units. And they were asking anybody that could come because they just didn't know what was going on. And it was a huge school. When you're dealing with an event like that, you spend a lot of man hours and your SWAT teams really get tired fast. You know, you can only be intense for a certain amount of time, and then you got to have a break or things go wrong. So we responded about an hour after Columbine. We helped to clear the school. I helped, find students that were hiding in rooms. They weren't sure if the shooting was over with, and we pulled them out of the school, got them to a safe area, ended up searching the whole school. I still have visuals of some of the kids that were murdered there and seeing their bodies, and that was traumatic. I remember that was, one of those events in your life that you never forget. And I remember going back home after working Columbine that day and sitting down and just crying. It was one of those things that when you see a major shooting like that, you're changed for life. And what's interesting in this case is that, I responded to that Columbine shooting in 1999. And I have a stepson who's also in the FBI, and he responded to the Stoneman Douglas shooting in Florida in 2018. So I basically have a generational situation with family going to major school shootings, which is not something I want to to remember, but it's interesting, and I'm hoping that as a community and as law enforcement that we can prevent these things from happening.
Yes. I mean, what do you think is some of the biggest misconceptions about Columbine?
I think you realize, because I've been to the Columbine shooting, I've been to the Aurora theater shooting, I've been to a lot of other different shootings over my career, and you realize how simple that a 1 or 2 person shooting can do, and how deadly it can be. It can be as simple as one person with one handgun, or in Columbine, 2 people with automatic weapons and makeshift bombs. I think the misconception is how do you stop one of these things? You can't be investigating every person in the United States to see if they're thinking about doing something like this. A lot of these are lone wolf situations. You've got a disgruntled person and they go into a business or into a school and they just start shooting it up. And I don't know how to prevent those other than I think the triggers and people noticing that, the students noticing it, reporting it to their teachers, or an employee reporting it to their boss. Hey, this guy's very angry and, he's starting to make some threats, or at least going that direction. I think those are the things that we just got to start looking for.
A couple of weeks ago, I had Sally Rawlings on the show, and she's also from Colorado. It's escaping me now what the name of the law is, but in Colorado, there was a law, and there might still be a law. And I think it had to do with taking away guns if there was mental illness in the house.
I think, and I can't remember the name of the law either, but they're working on it and refining it on being able to take weapons from people that are having some mental instability. And from in the house, if officers respond to some place and they realize, hey, this guy's really not level-headed, and they find some weapons, then they'll take the weapons and they have to justify getting them back. I'm not, working on the street anymore, so I could be a little bit wrong about those, but I think that's a great situation. When we start seeing people that are starting to deteriorate mentally, for their safety and others, we can't give them easy access to weapons that can kill mass people.
Yeah, and you mentioned Aurora as well, responding to that one. So I guess if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Aurora theater shooting, I was actually not in town when the actual shooting occurred.
Oh, okay.
I ended up a little bit later, but I did the cell phone analysis for the suspect, and I ended up being a witness at that trial. So it was an interesting cellular analysis. He didn't live far from the theater, so we were able to show his phone at his home, where he had booby-trapped his house for law enforcement when they came to his house that would have exploded if they didn't handle that correctly. You know, he did the theater shooting. He was actually caught at the theater, leaving the theater. But we looked at some of the historical records and put him at shooting ranges. He had gone to shooting ranges prior to the theater shooting and practiced. So things like that were things that were brought up in court later on.
So do you think he just snapped, or is this more evil driven?
Well, from what I know about the case, there was indications that he was starting to become unlevel in his thinking and being suspicious and being, feeling like people were out to get him months prior to the shooting. And if I remember right, he was actually supposed to, or had been seeing some therapists and then stopped seeing those therapists, and those therapists either didn't understand or didn't, raise the alarms that possibly could have been prevented that situation.
All right. Well, let's take one final break. When we come back, I want to get in a little bit more about Hawk Analytics. And I also want to talk about some personal interest of yours, fishing, hiking, and camping. You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Rhea Gerstenkorn, and my advice to you is to not be that analyst that people refer to as to what not to do. You don't want to be that person. So make sure that your products are of quality, make sure that you're doing what you need to do, ask questions if you're not sure, but don't be the reference point of what not to do.
Hey everyone, it's Mindy from Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. Jason and I are happy to announce a new limited podcast series called Sean Bear's Guide to Hiring a Law Enforcement Analyst. In this series, Jason and Sean talk about different steps of the hiring process from both the standpoint of the hiring manager and the job seeker. As someone who recently got a new job during the production of the series, this really resonated with me. I learned a lot from this guide, and it validated a lot of little practices I normally do, like bringing a portfolio or sending a thank you letter after the interview. Little things I thought didn't make that much of a difference, but could really give you an advantage over the competition. I think this guide provides great insights into the hiring world, and Sean is so passionate about making sure that both parties are happy and benefit from the results. Obviously, this series was designed with hiring a quality analyst in mind, but I think the lessons can be utilized for other professions as well. Don't forget to check out our other projects on our website at www.leapodcast.com. Thanks!
Hi, this is Paul Arnold, and I just want to tell you the difference between the fast lane and the passing lane is that you're supposed to be passing in the far left passing lane. Even if you think you're going fast enough, get out of the lane.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking to Scott about some of the cases that he's worked on throughout his career. And I wanted to finish up this interview, Scott, talking about your current work with Hawk Analytics. And I guess just one final question from the FBI before we get to that is, when did you know it was time to retire from the FBI and move on?
Well, if I could have stayed there indefinitely, I would have. In the FBI, they have an age limit of 57. So I was getting close to that age, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to stay longer. So when this job came up at Hawk Analytics, I jumped right over. So I'd already met my retirement mandates of 20 years, and I was over 50 at that time, and I could retire. And I actually did 22 years.
Okay. And then so you hopped right in, right? You didn't take any break or anything. You just went from FBI to Hawk Analytics.
Yeah, I had 1 day off between the FBI. I ended it on December 31st, 2018, and started January 2nd of 2019 with Hawk Analytics.
Oh, you're so lazy. So you've mentioned it a couple of times in this interview already, but I guess for somebody that is listening that isn't familiar with Hawk Analytics, just like overview of what the company is, what the company does, services it provides.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. And I had known about Hawk Analytics prior to leaving the FBI. It was just another company out there that had developed software to help law enforcement analyze map and do link analysis with call detail records. And a lot of the law enforcement that I worked with while I was in the FBI were customers of Hawk Analytics. So when I was looking for a place to go after the FBI, Hawk Analytics was a perfect fit for me. I just jumped right into being one of their experts at Hawk Analytics. And again, it's a company that teaches law enforcement how to analyze and really pull all the data out of phone records. And we've expanded to other things like Google records, tower dumps, mapping, GPS data. But the company itself has been around since 2013. And the founder, Mike Melson, was an engineer and also a software developer. And he had actually was working cases pro bono in California. He was working missing person cases, helping organize search teams, stuff like that. He was really into helping those type law enforcement in those ways. And one time, one of the law enforcement guys said, "Hey, we got these phone records from, this phone company on this missing person. We don't have anybody that understands them." And he goes, "Well, I understand them." So that was kind of the light bulb of, he realized that there was a need in law enforcement for them to be able to understand and map and analyze these records. So he formed Hawk Analytics, and then the software he wrote called CellHawk. We have a lot of great people here at the company. We have about 150 years of law enforcement experience, 50 combined years of cellular analysis experience, and I've been doing it for 13 years myself. I'm the director of professional services at Hawk Analytics, and that means that I do cases for law enforcement and civil cases if needed, where I can come in, do the analysis, and be an expert and testify at trial. We also handle training. We put on a 40-hour training session every month for law enforcement to come in and really get involved in how the cellular technology works, how to be able to defend it in court, how the phone chose that tower, the mapping of the towers and sectors, the link analysis. We've talked about pattern analysis, what's normal, what's abnormal, sleep time, busy times of phones. And we actually get into report writing and testimony, how to testify in court to this type stuff. So that 40-hour course is a really good course to go to. It's kind of the stuff that I learned, in the FBI and the CAS team, bringing it to another company, we have about 500 different law enforcement agencies all around the nation that use our software. And we have a lot of free stuff we give to anybody in law enforcement, where we have a website where you can get the phone numbers for the phone companies, the search warrant templates, the preservation templates, the court cases that are coming up that have popped up recently on cell phone records or Google records, stuff like that. All that's available. And we're basically a software company, but that's evolved into really helping law enforcement understand and get these records and help put bad guys in jail.
So we didn't really get into it before, but smartphones, it's a total different ballgame, right? I mean, there's just so much more on the phone now that is collected and can be analyzed.
Right. I mean, if you're thinking from, the first cell phone I had was, I think, probably year one in the FBI, and I got a brick phone. It was about the size of a brick, had an antenna that was about 2 feet long, and you had to plug it into the car because, it had a battery, but it wouldn't last very long. You had to plug it into the car, and you're lucky if you could ever make a phone call on it. And now the cell phones are in your watch. That's how small, and the technology's changed over time. And the use of this stuff from, just toll records to tower and sector and locational information, pattern analysis has changed. The phones themselves have gotten so, they cost $1,000. The good ones cost over $1,000. A lot of the stuff is collected in the phone, and we've got a lot of good experts out there that download a lot of that information from the phone itself. But all those applications that you're using on your phone, like Life 360 to kind of keep track of your kids, or WhatsApp or Snapchat or TikTok or any of those applications, all those things are storing some information either on the phone or in the company. Facebook stores who you talk to, who you chat with, some locational information. Google stores a lot of information on your location, either based on GPS or Wi-Fi, cellular stuff, and even Bluetooth. And they determine your location by that stuff for advertising purposes, and so that you can, look up where's the closest McDonald's and how do I get there. So all that stuff is so much data out there that helps you in your cases. If you're not using it, you're missing a lot that can definitely help.
That's interesting because, again, for the longest time, too, I think I do have the Facebook app on it now. But for the longest time, I actually used the browser. But I don't think that makes much of a difference whether you're using the browser or using the app.
That's true. I mean, a lot of the browsers, if you're using Google, if you've loaded, if either it's an Android phone and it's actually programmed into the phone to log your locational information. Things have changed over the years. They just did it no matter what originally, but now you have to opt into it. Say, yes, you can use my location information. But Apple's been doing it, Google's been doing it, all the applications that the kids are using or even adults are using now are also given when you sign up for that application, you're saying, yes, you can use my location information to help me do whatever I want to do in this app. Those companies are recording that data, and it's definitely helpful to law enforcement.
And then you also mentioned training, I guess, pre-COVID. Are you traveling across the country? And what are you doing now?
Yeah, pre-COVID, we were traveling, we were doing 8 one-week classes a year, and we were traveling to different parts of the United States to try to, get customers from that area. We'd travel to Florida, we did a training here in Colorado, we'd go to California, so we could be more general, in different areas so that people could easier get to the training. Since COVID, we've had to, at least for the rest of this year, move our training to online. And we're using Zoom or other programs like that to have a class, which has been a challenge. We went from 50 people in an in-person class to about 25 in an online class, so that we could help them and make sure they're getting the information they need. I'm presenting, I'm doing a PowerPoint, but there's breakout rooms, and we actually give them, records to analyze, and they have a couple minutes to do either it by hand. We teach by hand first. How do you map this by hand? Just go to a mapping program and put a dot on the map and draw a sector and the direction of the sector correctly based on the phone records. And then we teach them how to use CellHawk and all of the tools that CellHawk provides, and makes it quicker and easier to use.
Excellent. Let's move on to your personal interests, because you're big into fishing, hiking, and camping. And those are all things you can do still in the COVID era here. So what have you been maybe doing this summer?
Yeah, I'm blessed. My activities are outside, and there's some good social distancing when I'm out on a boat halfway down the lake and there's no one even close to me, me and my dog or me and my son or something like that, we can easily social distance and fish at the same time. So I had to make some changes from moving from the East Coast when I was in college and high school and lived there as a child, to the bass fishing that I was doing there, to the kind of high altitude, walleye and trout fishing that I do here in Colorado. And definitely not a pro. I was out fishing just over this Labor Day weekend and caught some good walleye, and we had some nice walleye for dinner. Very
Nice.
good fish to eat, not very fishy. And we actually went camping this last weekend too. And good things to do in this kind of period, which is where you still have to social distance.
Have you either fished or hiked or camped in maybe some exotic places or far away places?
Nothing outside of the United States. I'd love to do some fishing up in Alaska. Most of my fishing has been here in Colorado, other than, when I was bass fishing back in Virginia and North Carolina. But there's some beautiful places to fish and hike here in Colorado. I mean, that's one of the things that I love about Colorado, is that we have about 330 days of sunshine a year. So you can always find time to get out into the wilderness and do some fun stuff.
Have you hiked far enough to get into the various altitude that you're like, you start your hike in shorts and by the end you're in freezing temperatures.
Yeah, and you do have to be careful when you're doing that. Those are fun hikes. It usually is an all-day hike, and you have to be prepared for any type of weather. One of the things when you live in Colorado, you learn, even when you're not hiking, is that in your car you should have shorts, you should have flip-flops, you should have your snowshoes, you should have coats and long pants, because the weather can change, especially at this time of year, dramatically fast. Give you a quick example. Monday was 100 degrees. Tuesday, the high was 36, and we had snow. There was a 60-degree difference between the days. We just had a cold front come through, and because of the mountains and where we are in the United States, it dropped the temperature. There was moisture, and we had 2 or 3 inches on the ground in one day, where the day before it was 100 degrees, and I was in shorts out on the boat.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember I interviewed with a company years ago in Denver, and I flew in, had the interview, and was at the interview, and it was a beautiful day in the morning. And then all of a sudden, while I'm in the office waiting for the interview, it just starts raining, but it starts raining at a pace that is like a shower, and it didn't stop for like 2 or 3 hours. So I get out of my interview and the whole street of Denver is flooded. The water is above the curb on the roads. And it was a miracle that my taxi driver was able to get me to the airport to make my flight back.
Yeah,
So.
That's one of the things we do have here is when it does rain, it rains hard and fast. And we're very dry here, and we have to water our lawns a lot, and that's expensive. And if you don't, your grass dies here just because of the amount of sun. But one of the things in Colorado, if you don't like the weather, just wait an hour, it'll change. It's not like the East Coast, where I remembered as when I was younger is, all right, we're going to have rain. It's going to be rain for 3 days straight. You don't ever see that in Colorado. You get an hour or two, and then you're sunny again.
All right, Scott. Well, our last segment is Words to the World, and this is where I give the guest the last word, and you can promote any idea that you want to. But Scott, what are your words to the world?
Well, my words to the world really kind of are based on cell phone records and analysis. Consider doing cellular analysis in every case that you have. And I'm not talking about the misdemeanor cases. I'm talking about the felonies. All felonies, you should be getting phone records. Not only it's going to help your case, you can get the practice you need. Don't just do it in the major cases, the homicides, the kidnapping, stuff like that. Do it on your burglary cases. Do it on your robbery cases. Get those records. The more experience that you have looking at these records and analyzing them, the better you will get at it. Prosecutors are expecting it now. The prosecutors love this type of data. It's independent. It's much better than an eyewitness nowadays or something that effect, where you're an independent investigator. It's kind of like DNA. It's kind of like the new DNA. You get the records. It came from the phone company. You're doing the analysis. It's independent of all the other evidence in the case. Additionally, make sure you're having your analysis peer reviewed. Someone else in your agency or another agency that you know that knows how to do this, make sure they're reviewing it. You can make mistakes, and it can make you look like you're not doing it right. And 1 or 2 mistakes in your analysis while you're on the stand will make the jury think that you're not know what you're doing. Get the training you need. It's hard. I know budgets with nowadays or with law enforcement are tough, but this is a technique and something that is so important for any law enforcement agency. It's a tool in your toolbox. Educate yourself, go to class. If you don't feel like you can testify as an expert, find someone that can. I think those are the important things when we're dealing with analytical phone records that I wanted to make sure everybody knows.
Good advice. Well, Scott, I leave everybody with, you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later, but I do appreciate you coming on the show, and thank you again, and you be safe.
Thank you very much for having me, Jason.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to the Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.